Thank you all so much for coming tonight. Thank you for coming for a conversation with our 2014 Kestnbaum writer-in-residence, Lynne Tillman. She's kindly agreed to sit down and talk with me and all of you about her work, about her thoughts on art and literature, and literary craft, and the life of being a writer, and about whatever else is on your mind. As always, this is a conversation between all of us, so please feel free to interrupt me and raise your hand at any point and ask a question. Please, if you could also turn off your phone at this point or mute it. So how we're going to structure this is very casual. Lynne and I will start discussing the work that I handed out to most of you. I think most of you might have a copy of this, but it's not absolutely necessary. It's 3 short stories from her collection, her most recent collection, Someday This Will Be Funny, and as well as a brief excerpt from her novel, American Genius. Now, I know a lot of people here are fiction writers, but I know we also have nonfiction writers, we have poets, we have artists. Perhaps there are also people who don't practice the arts, but are just a fan of them. Please, no matter your genre or your interest, ask what's on your mind, okay? Lynne is a fount of knowledge and opinions on just about everything, mostly because she's probably written something very thought-provoking on it. You are kind of the embodiment of like a rare creature nowadays, the contemporary person of letters. We don't have too many of them. Lynne is the author of 4 short story collections, Someday This Will Be Funny being the most recent one. She's also written 5 novels, including American Genius and No Lease on Life, which was a New York Times notable book and a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award. I want to ask you about that. I remember reading an interview about you talking about the way it changes people's response to you. Mm-hmm. She collaborates frequently with artists, her writing appearing regularly in artist books, museum catalogs, and journals like Art Forum and Art in America. She has also published 3 nonfiction books, The Velvet Years, Warhol's Factory, Bookstore, The Life and Times of Jeanette Watson and Books and Company, and The Broad Picture. Her most recent book of essays, What Would Lynne Tillman Do, was published, last month, right?
That's right.
And you cover in there film, art, popular icons, cultural icons. One of my favorite writers, Edith Wharton, Jane Bowles, who you prefer to Paul Bowles, who I love. But I haven't read Jane Bowles yet. I'm sorry.
Haven't?
I'm sorry.
Well, unfortunately, there isn't a great deal to read of hers, but once you read 2 Serious Ladies, life will be different for you, I promise you.
And a few more things. She is a graduate of Hunter College and is currently professor and writer-in-residence at the University of Albany. And you also still teach at the School of Visual Arts?
I do a little bit for them they have an MFA thesis, an MFA in art writing and art criticism that was started and run by David Levi Strauss, who's himself a poet and a critic. And I've been the thesis seminar guide. Okay. And I'm cutting back on that. I also teach at the New School in a program that's being ended because it was funded by Len Riggio of Barnes & Noble. And with Barnes & Noble going, what do they say at Forbes magazine? Belly up. Yeah. He's also ending this program, which was too bad. The program was for undergraduates in the writing department called Writing and Democracy. And so that was a great program to teach in. And so I was
how are the bookstores doing? I mean, I keep hearing that there's a resurgence for independent bookstores, especially in New York. But then I read recently about one of the big ones closing down in New York. I wasn't sure.
It's odd because in Brooklyn you've got some very healthy independent bookstores, and with Barnes & Noble closing, that should open up more situations. But mostly real estate, anyway, in the city, because I can't speak about too many other places ever since having written bookstore about Books and Company. I knew a lot more then, but that was 1999 and things have changed. But the real estate in New York is fantastically expensive.
Yes.
And obviously there's no real estate involved in virtual online buying of books, but then you have this idea of a community that physically comes together rather than virtually, which still has some play in various parts of town, especially in Brooklyn right now. There's some very vibrant bookstores there.
Well, there was that profile recently about the young woman who, she comes from wealth, and she opened up a bookstore when no one told her, everyone told her you shouldn't do this. She sunk in millions of dollars, and she's very successful. I forgot her name, though. It was about a month ago. There was a big profile in the New York Times.
I think if you sink in millions of dollars, you'll have a run for a while.
Yeah, if you have those funds. Yeah. Well, I should also add that you were fiction editor at Finn's magazine for, you said 15 issues. Was that also 15 years?
No, that was 8 years.
8 years.
Yes, yeah.
8 years. So I'm sure there'll be questions about that, because I know a lot of students here are already, if not going to send out their work. So.
Okay.
But let's talk. Let's talk first. I guess we can begin. And again, if you have any questions, please raise your hand and raise them up high so I can catch them. I guess we can start with the first short story in the packet we have here.
That's How Wrong My Love Is.
That's How Wrong My Love Is.
Yeah.
And it's one of my favorite pieces, and someday this will be funny. The first question I have for you might be obvious, but you know, the little that I know you live in New York, I know you live in an apartment, I can't help but conflate the narrator with you in some sense. And I was just curious, when you're using the first person point of view in that way, how much do you bring yourself into that, especially when the narrator bears a lot of resemblance to you?
Does she?
I don't know.
I don't know. Certain. You know, I use everything I can when I write a story, and you know, the I is perfect in fiction. It's a shifter like the other pronouns, and anyone can fill it, and I hope the reader does and forgets about the author behind it. I'm really not interested in the fact that I may or may not have fed mourning doves. It was Lydia.
Have you, though?
Do I have? Have you, though? Do you notice how he came in close? Have you? Well, you know, I'll take the fifth on that, really. But it was Lydia Davis who suggested I write this. I was asked to write something for an art and literary magazine in London called The Happy Hypocrite, and they were doing a theme issue on hunting and gathering. And I said, I really have nothing to say about hunting and gathering, not at this moment. She said, but what about those mourning doves that you like so much? Mm-hmm. So, you know how it is. You take, if there's something that is useful to me as a writer that I might have done, but once you're writing, you're representing, and it's no longer about, at least it's never for me about myself. Mm-hmm. And then I throw in lots of other things when I think it's necessary.
Well, it seems like the fact that you chose mourning doves, I mean, that's inherently important, right? I mean, I wondered if it was intentional, since the name itself is a kind of anthropomorphism on our part, right, calling them that.
Yes, but their cry, have you heard their cry?
I actually haven't.
It's
I should have YouTubed it.
No, am I going to try to imitate a mourning dove? I don't think so, but I'm sure if you go onto YouTube, you'll have a lot of people imitating mourning doves. But it's a mournful cry. Mm-hmm. And they're very interesting birds. They're also half the size of pigeons. So they are in the dove
that family.
Yes. But they're doves. And I became fascinated by them and read up a little bit about them. And so I use all of that in the story.
Well, the thing I asked is that in my reading of it, it seems like you're setting up this dichotomy between humans embodied by the narrator and animals embodied by the mourning dove.
Right.
And the narrator's observations of the dove seem kind of weighted by a constant tension between a desire to see them through the lens of human emotion, right? That's how she interacts with them, and that's how she creates this bond with them. and yet at the same time an awareness that they are incapable of things like love and cognition, right?
Well, I don't know that they're incapable of. They are very loving with each other, and they mate for life.
They do, yeah.
Yeah.
I
don't know
that.
if that's love, but it's something.
Familiarity, maybe?
Well, and also the way they have sex is very interesting. And they have foreplay, and they peck at each other, and then they look at each other, and they actually kiss, and then the male mounts the female, and then they kiss some more. They really do. And it's really very charming. So I think there's some feeling there. I mean, it may be more or less than human feeling, who knows?
Well, what seems interesting is that at the end of the story, I mean, the narrator is convinced, as I imagine, well, you just kind of said that you are too, that there is a kind of human quality to the behavior of the doves. But at the end, there seems to be a kind of, it seems to me she's recognizing that they're kind of in between being that kind of dumb animal and fully human. And the important difference between them is ethics, and something that makes life incredibly problematic for humans. You know, you called it the predicament between principle and desire, right? I just found that interesting because it seems to me that we share with animals a kind of innate selfishness, right? An all-consuming desire to pursue what we want. But unlike us, animals are not burdened by the ethics of having these desires. At least I don't think they are. Maybe you do. But and in a sense, I feel like that is like they are not burdened by the pursuit of happiness. Do you see what I mean?
Yes, I do.
Which is something that as humans, I feel we conceptualize that. We can't help but do that. Both fulfilling and failing at that pursuit of happiness. And that seems like one thing that is a major difference between us and animals.
Well, it's interesting because brain size isn't everything, apparently. I was watching, and I watch a lot of animal programs, and I learn a lot from animals. And for instance, the crow is a very smart animal and is much smaller than, let's say, a chimp, but it uses its brain in such a way, like a chimp, that it's about as smart as a chimpanzee up to a certain point. The question about ethics, it seemed to me that the relationship that many of us have to animals or the animal world, and with the growing environmental and ecological movements, we're in a kind of conundrum. Many people have become vegetarians or even vegans, yet continue to wear leather or feathers or whatever. We're usually inconsistent in our relationships, but to the objects around us. Animals seem to be less inconsistent in their behavior, which is fascinating to me. They're going to have to do certain things in order to survive, and they don't seem to be distracted in the way that we might be distracted because of our bigger brains, let's say, that allow for more options and more tools to be made and so on. And yet you see the relationship between animals and humans. I try not to anthropomorphize as much as I want to, but how else? It's very hard to read through to others without using your own ideas about existence.
But you know, you mentioned that kind of consistency that animals have. I mean, how does that then, I mean, the title of the story is How Wrong Is My Love? I mean, I can't help but...
That's how wrong my love is. Yeah.
That's how wrong my love is.
That's right.
I'm sorry.
Well, because I'm questioning and I'm critical of these relationships that I make, and my own perceptions, I don't entirely trust them. I live with them, I act out of them in some ways, but I wouldn't, I wouldn't say that they're accurate. And I think ethics comes into that place of inaccuracy. Why do you do what you do? On what basis do you make the choices that you make? For instance, I'm not a vegetarian.
Mm-hmm.
And that seems to me odd, given how much I love animals. And yet, I don't seem yet able to break the habit of eating chicken. I don't know what I would do without eating chicken. And this isn't a value that I want to, kind of proselytize for or something. It's just something that I notice and watch in myself and others. I mean, American Genius, a comedy, which is the full title of the book, came about because I was looking at my country, the United States, and all of the incredible sensitivity that Americans I knew, were claiming to have about everything, about their skin, about what they ate, about being lactose intolerant, about being intolerant in other ways and sensitive in other ways. And I thought, this is really strange. And we had recently started a preemptive war in Iraq. Mm-hmm. And that seemed to me insensitive, very insensitive. So I was juggling these two odd relationships, and that's where I started American Genius, a comedy from a questioning of all this sensitivity that was around me, which is why I used skin as the trope for the novel. That's right. The skin is also the largest organ of the body, and it expands and contracts, and so the novel goes from minutiae to much greater
American history,
wars. Yes, wars and so on. And I was really interested in that, in using that possibility. So I'll find my material, whether it's That's How Wrong My Love Is, or what's in American Genius, a comedy, in part from the contradictions I see existing around me in culture and society.
And I mean, as a writer, I mean, pointing out that contradiction, what's the next step as a writer? Or is it just your obligation to point out that contradiction compellingly?
I don't know that a writer has an obligation. And first of all, no one asked you to write, or to make art. I think that's an important thing. It's a decision you make for yourself. And the obligation that I feel might be different from what somebody else might feel. If obligation is the right word. And I'm not sure about that. I had a discussion, actually I wrote one of my Freeze columns had to do with that question of obligation in a discussion I had with an artist friend, and he was being questioned after giving a talk about his work. He's a well-known artist and does a lot of talks, and you're often called to task. Somebody in the audience will say, well, and I don't see that in your work, mm-hmm. And you're kind of held to a certain kind of reckoning. And I'm just not sure what kind of reckoning artists and writers both are in such a weird cultural position. I don't know if any cultural anthropologists have actually done a sort of structural study of the relationship of the artist to the community. I'm sure there's been work done on shamans and others, but just turning the lens back on ourselves is always interesting. Actually, the novel I'm working on now, its protagonist is a cultural anthropologist who's studying family images. He's an ethnographer looking at photography.
But you actually refer to this.
I just keep on going away from this. Sorry.
No, please. I mean, you refer to this though in Try Again, in your new collection.
Yes.
And I just want to quote this real quick because I find it very interesting. Visual artists are often called to account for their choices and asked to defend their positions. Few occupations other than finance, politics, and crime entail this reckoning. Writers and artists may ask themselves why they make art or write, and many feel the pointlessness of their self-chosen jobs. But all rebuttals and answers to the existential questions rest on faith in art or literature. Faith itself will be tested. Mm-hmm. Can you elaborate a little bit on this faith that you're referring to?
Well, if you answer the questions about why you do what you do, well, writers are often asked, why do you write?
Yeah.
Which is a stunningly impossible question to answer. And again, all answers will be retrospective. And if you make art, if you write, you might feel there a faith, and I think I capitalized faith.
You did. Yeah.
In your relationship to making art or to writing, and that faith is something that you feel, some kind of attitude toward. I mean, look at Samuel Beckett. It's amazing. He kept on writing, even though he questioned the point of not only writing but of life again and again. And yet, obviously, he felt so strongly about doing it that he contradicted himself all the time. I find that immensely poignant. But I think that we, as writers and artists, answer those questions by how and what we write and what that faith is. I don't mean it as a cult or something. And in fact, I feel allergic to certain kinds of things that artists and writers say about, having a calling, or that, their characters write themselves. And I don't know, things like that. It just drives me completely crazy.
I'm actually curious. I mean, there are kind of cliches that come about.
Yes.
The more you go to people's readings, writers have kind of repeat the same kinds of sentiments. I mean, what are some others that have always bothered you? Because I'm bothered by many of them as well.
Pretty much all of them. All of these. God, I can't remember them now.
Let me give you an example.
Okay, good.
Let's make this about me.
Okay.
No, but I'm curious what your opinion on this,
Okay.
because I have a friend who everywhere he goes, he says, writing, at the end of the day, it's about hard work. It's about hard work and how much effort you're putting into it. That is the difference between a successful writer and an unsuccessful writer. And every time I hear him say that, I want to say, no, everything is about hard work. What is not about hard work? Sometimes people are born with it, and sometimes people cultivate it. But just to say that it's hard work seems like a thing that makes people feel better during failure.
Well, if you're going to feel better, it should be during failure, I guess. There's yes, and that's extremely annoying. All of that statement is, and why is it so?
Because I'm glad you agree.
yes, I do. Writing is about hard work. On its face, it has problems. Writing is about hard work. I don't know that it's about hard work. It can be hard to write a good sentence, that's for sure. Mm-hmm. But I think he's probably arguing, he or she is arguing against the idea that writing just flows out of you. You sit down and, so trying to make a case for, I'm an artist or a writer, but don't get me wrong, I really, labor, I'm a practitioner and all of that, defending against some notion that you're just some kind of fairy creature who lands on the desk and opens the computer and it all just flows out or something. I don't know what writing is. And I've made little stabs at trying to think about it or maybe even write about it. I always think it's insufficient.
I can only think of it as an impulse. I mean, and sometimes an indefinable impulse. I mean, it goes back to what you're saying about the question, why do you write? Well,
yeah.
I don't know, I guess it's an impulse.
I was 8 years old when I decided I was going to be a writer.
Wow.
Now, at 8 years old, you're 1 year beyond the age of reason.
I was 5.
You were 5.
Yeah.
Well, you weren't
I beat
even.
you there.
Yeah, you certainly did. And but it came from writing compositions in class. Was that 2nd or 3rd grade? And we were asked. I guess we were studying Charles the Great, Charlemagne, and we were asked to go home and bring in a composition on Charlemagne. Well, I wrote Charlemagne, Man of War, and I was so excited I wrote Charlemagne, Man of Peace. And, which is actually, I probably haven't gotten any further than that in there's that contradiction. He was one and he was the other. But after that, that was it for me. And I went to my mother and I said, I'm going to be a writer. And she looked down at me and she said, but I didn't think you had any talent. And there you go. You don't really need to be encouraged.
But how has your conception of being a writer, how has it evolved, or has it evolved? I mean,
well, that's the thing. One of the saddest things is when somebody says to you, I've written a few poems, can I call myself a writer?
yeah.
And I think, why is that important? I said, you write your poems and that's what you do. I think being a writer or being a painter or being a filmmaker is it's not an essential identity. There's not an identity to that. It is only when you're doing it really. You could say that I've made to myself a decision that I'm going to keep writing. Or you could say that it wasn't a decision, but I seem to have a need to keep writing. Mm-hmm. And then I write one thing, and then I find a reason to write another thing. That's my way of doing or keeping busy, because otherwise life would, be
dull.
Or worse.
Yeah.
For me, not. But I think that being a writer. I remember one time a photographer said, I'm photographing people in their studios. Could I come photograph you? I said, but I'm a writer. I said, I don't do anything. I sit at a desk or I read a book. I said, it's completely not visual. Whatever's going on, it's here. And you can't see that, not yet anyway.
But is the act of writing, is something that you're constantly thinking about? It seems like in the 3 stories and even in American Genius.
I think about writing all the time. That's true. I think about writing all the time. I sometimes wish I didn't, because it could drive me crazy. I'm not at a dinner party and talking and thinking about writing at the same time. But something happens and I'm trying to find ways that I could make it a sentence, or maybe there's a story in it for me, or isn't that interesting, the way somebody said something? People, I'm fascinated by people, and why is somebody like that?
But the work also, it's often, whether indirectly or directly, about the process of writing.
Some of it is, yes. Yeah.
I feel like the shadow of a doubt.
Yes.
How
so? Let's see, I have to look.
Well, you have this man, Thomas, who attends the wedding of his ex-lover, Grace, whom he still is in love with, but who rejected him because she said she was incapable of love, and she cites the trauma of her mother abandoning her as the reason. Now, Thomas goes to the wedding, ends up leaving the tent, and goes into the forest, finds himself by the pond, and he calls up the myth of Narcissus. And what's interesting at one point for me was when he starts thinking of all the what-ifs if he and Grace had ended up together, and he says he thinks there was too much he couldn't control. And then he sees this reflection of a old, rotten woman in the pond. And he starts creating a narrative and says, oh, that's Grace's mother. This is the reason Grace's abandonment by her mother made her not love me. This is the reason. And he starts creating a narrative. He's a writer there. And it seems to me like the process of writing, at least there, or at least in my conception of it sometimes, is about kind of imposing control and order on something that is inherently chaotic or intolerable.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Do you view writing in those terms at all? Or if so, if not, I mean, what were you trying to get at there?
In that specific story?
Yeah.
Well, I don't think you have to be a writer to tell yourself stories, or to, in fact, I think we all tell ourselves stories, and some of us are writers who tell those stories. But, you know, you're telling me the story back is fascinating. I think, how did I write that? Where did that come from? I don't know.
Can I tell everybody, Lynne told me something so interesting today, and I never thought to verbalize it this way. When you were talking about teaching creative writing, and when students say, well, you didn't get what I was trying to do. You don't understand my story. And what did you say?
I said, you asked me what I would say to a student who said that. Yeah. I said, it doesn't, it's what the reader makes of it.
The writer doesn't control the story.
The writer doesn't, the reader controls the story.
I just controlled your story.
Yeah. But it was very interesting, and I think you were narrating it back, but it's so interesting when, I mean, that's why it's so great that people read your work, because they, or come to hear you talk about it, or want to write themselves, because you're making something, and the way you talked about it remakes what I put there, your emphases on things, different from my own. To say that he's writing a narrative, and I don't know that I thought, I mean, I can see that interpretation of it. Mm-hmm. But I think that when I was writing it, if I can get back to that moment, I saw him, I saw this kind of break. It goes into a sort of fantasy, something that I don't usually do too much in my writing, sometimes, but it becomes like a fairy tale.
Yes. Where
he goes off into the woods. And I was thinking about, well, probably quite a number of much earlier writers, including Dante. But this idea of leaving the space that you're in and going into something that could become a space for unreason. And he has an unreasonable or even irrational experience among the animals and falling asleep. And it's as if he's asleep but awake while he's asleep, dreaming. And that's always very interesting to me, these sort of spaces in which you're there and not there at the same time.
Do you feel that way when you're writing? Is that ever?
I don't feel that I exist when I'm writing.
How do you mean?
I just I think what I enjoy for myself is that I stop being Lynne. Mm-hmm. My Lynne-ness goes, and whatever it is that I am doesn't matter. It's only what is going on the page in the computer. And that's what makes me happy. Everything else in my life drops away.
Isn't that hard to access because life is always there? Is it hard for you? I mean,
well, yeah, I think sometimes getting over to the writing can be difficult, but once I'm in it, anxieties about everything else. I have only the anxiety of the word I'm going to choose, or the sentence, or is this conceptually solid? Can I actually make this work? Especially working on a longer piece. So it's funny, I had a conversation with a writer friend of mine, Robert Gluck, and in San Francisco, and he and some other writers that I've been grouped with in called New Narrative, which is as good a, I mean, it never did gain any traction, but anyway,
it was old narrative.
Yes, and he sometimes puts his own name into a novel, and as did Kathy Acker or Dennis Cooper and some other writers that I know and am friends with, and And I said I never wanted to do that. And he said it was about, I said, why do you want to do that? Because to me it's very strange. I don't want to write about myself, and I don't really care about myself when I'm writing. I know that's an odd thing to say, because obviously you have to have a certain amount of ego, I guess, to write. But I'm really not interested in myself when I'm writing, which is what makes me happy. So Bob Gluck said he likes the reader to have a question about the narrator and the author. And I said I really wasn't interested in that question. And it's true, I'm not. It's not something that I want to focus on in my writing. So for me, writing is really about not being Lynne anymore.
That's so interesting.
Is it?
Well, it's interesting to me because it's like, when I saw, Narcissus, the myth of Narcissus in that story, I immediately thought of, if this story is indeed about writing and the writer, the act of writing and being a writer, the impulse, I can't help but think of writers as narcissistic in many ways. And
why? I mean, I'm not saying that there aren't narcissistic writers, but
well, the whole process. I mean, like the first of all, the things you ignore.
There's primary narcissism, which we all need some of, right?
Yeah.
And then there's secondary narcissism. So if the primary narcissism, this is in sort of Freudian terms, is working for you, which means to say you don't hate yourself, you are able to function and thrive in the world. And then there's the secondary kind, and we're surrounded by narcissists. I mean...
Well, it's the one that, maybe I'm not talking about the wrong kind of narcissist. You interviewed Paula Fox, who said, narcissism is not a good thing to have in the sense that you fill in everything with yourself.
Right.
And people suffer. So is that secondary narcissism?
Yes. Yeah, that's secondary narcissism.
And that's not good.
Well, no, because if you
even
feel...
as a writer?
No, as a writer, definitely not. I mean, because I feel often from, or often, too often from novels that I read, that the writer is trying in some sense to raise his or her protagonist or create that protagonist in such a way as to justify the author's unconscious or sometimes conscious life too. And to create a better, to be seen as good or better or as heroic or whatever. And to me, that's not an interesting challenge, but as for a writer. But if you are very narcissistic, if you are filling in all the gaps with yourself, if you are imagining that what you feel is valid and you're not concerned about what other people's feelings are, you're going to be writing that character, that protagonist again and again and again.
Excuse me, can I mention something?
Yeah.
I might be the only person who's actually not an artist or writer, and I'm a reader and a bookseller. And I have to say that contemporary writing is so much about the author that there's no room for the reader. And readers really don't like it.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? I mean, maybe I'm coming from a really different place of selling books and talking about books with readers. But
Well, that's what we were...
I know, but I mean, it's really, I don't know, sometimes I look at contemporary writing and I think, where's the reader in this?
I absolutely agree. We were talking about this. It
Earlier
was so
today.
interesting that we had to stop and save it for the...
Yes.
Really, the reader is missing. And you know, as much as you're writing for yourself, there is somebody who's going to read it. I mean, I'm hoping that that's part of what you're doing this for.
Are you talking to me? Am I your you?
Actually, I've read your book, so that's why I'm here.
Oh, thank you. To accuse me or to...
I'm not accusing you. I'm just saying,
I'm just kidding. Yeah.
because here I am, you know,
Yes.
this is a group of possible writers. This is what you want to do. You know, I don't have.
Well, I agree with you. I find
and I was actually agreeing with what you were
Yeah.
saying. Like, because as a reader, sometimes if you're reading, I mean, if you're seeing the name of the author, you think, I mean, granted, of course, they're going to be in the book. You're expressing yourself, but sometimes as a reader, you're like, really, do I have to be with him?
Well,
do you have to be so into the book as a reader?
Well, I
don't know.
I was
That's all I'm gonna say.
Thank
referring
you.
to your language and your syntax, the narrative voice in American Genius, and I was telling you this afternoon that it can be incredibly dense and discursive and equivocating. I mean, it's a difficult narrative voice, and yet it's incredibly readable. And I told you that if I can't imagine a contemporary writer, much younger writer these days, taking that same premise, taking those same ideas and try to create that voice, it would be much louder than your voice is.
I am a contemporary writer. What do you
you-
mean a younger writer?
Yeah, you're young too. But
I know what you mean, and there's something that Adorno said. He said that today only exaggeration. Of course, his today was much earlier. Only exaggeration can be the medium for truth, and I think some younger writers have taken that up unconsciously. Not his. We use this word loud. This sort of clamor for attention to the writer and not to the characters. And I find it very disheartening, and I'm really not interested. I also think about these novels as sort of novels of inexperience and not experience. I couldn't have written this novel when I was 30. No, it was there was a lot of experience that's gone into it, and also questions of craft. When I determined that I was going to write a novel with extremely long sentences, which I had never done before, I had to have the chops to do it. I wouldn't have had those when I was just starting out. I mean, in a way, we write the books that we can write. The reader, when I was about 12 years old, I have two older sisters. This is speak to you. And one of them, 6 years older, so she was 18 and I was 12, and I said, could she give me some writing advice? And she said, you should always take the reader by the hand. And that just stayed with me. So, and something that Harry Matthews said, who is a great American writer, and he said that you are your first reader. So if you put those two things together, you have to separate from you as you write and be your first reader and take yourself by the hand. In other words, if you can't follow yourself, why would anybody else follow you? So you're creating a trail that somebody else might want to go on with you, and you're the first person who has to recognize that. So it is about opening a space for the reader. And, I've also, Bakhtin was an important theorist to me in the way that he talked about heterogeneity and how the novel is, that words are shot through with other voices and other words. And that to me is, you're using, the language is social. It's not a private individual thing. It's made by human beings over time. And using words, there's so many words inside them that have been used by others also. That's an incredible, hypertext has always been here in that way.
Questions? I don't. Yeah, Peter.
Hi. So maybe I didn't follow, but so you're talking about how writing is such a part of your identity, but you always sort of see the role, like you were saying how you're always interested about forming sentences from an experience or something, always or like a situation, but also at the same time when you're writing, you're sort of disembodied. So when is there time to be you? Like when are you
that is, I guess it could be exhausting. When is it time to be you? Well, I'm being me now, although it's a certain me. I mean, if we were just having a coffee together or something, I might be a little different. But we're always performing ourselves in some ways. Maybe I'm most me when I'm most absent from everybody else. And I wake up in the morning and go into the kitchen and make myself a strong pot of tea, and maybe that's when I'm me. But I don't know. I find this thing very strange, and I certainly don't think there's some kind of essential me. There's a me that repeats a lot, that has a lot of habits. Me without my habits, I don't know. I mean, just, you go someplace and you don't have the kind of tea you want. I mean, that can be a major issue. But you have to adapt, you have to, there's a lot of adjustment in the thing. But is there another question to that?
No.
Yeah. Well, thank you for caring. Yes.
So you were talking about knowing that you wanted to be a writer from a very young age and having that kind of just surety about what you needed to do and feeling like writing is an impulse. And you're also talking about your own development as a writer and how you couldn't have written this story and written the character and done the narrative voice that you did when you were 30 or when you were a younger writer. So can you tell us about how you feel like you went about developing as a writer, or a time when you felt like you had a really important experience that pushed you forward as a writer or changed your voice, or when you felt like, I don't know, being like a young writer who's just starting out, you always have that fear of what am I writing? What if this sucks? How do I know? Or what really do I do? Because you were saying, being a writer is a very vague activity. It's not like you get a degree, or you can, but people say you shouldn't do that anymore. But it's not like, going to medical school and then you're like, now I am a doctor. So maybe I'm asking, can you tell us maybe one, if there was ever a time when you felt like you kind of arrived as a writer, or you had an aha moment where I'm not I decided I was going to be a writer, and now I'm actually doing it. And then also, can you tell us about a time when you felt like you really developed your voice as a writer?
Well, I'll take the second part first, because I don't believe in a writer's voice. For me, anyway, in my practice is, and I'm not saying that others wouldn't find it in my writing, no matter how many different styles I'll use, and but I think different stories, I want different voices for different stories, and the voice of a novel, let's say, will once I find the narrator, that voice will be what I work with. So that's how I think about it. That's such a hard question, because it's not as if one leaves insecurity behind. And I didn't have an aha moment. Or if I did, it was the longest aha, extended over 40 years, I was, after college, I went to Europe, and I lived there for 6.5 years in Amsterdam and London. And all the while, I was thinking about writing and doing different things, and I think no one knew what I was thinking about, but I knew what I was. And at a certain point, I knew I had to get out of Europe, because even if I was living in London, the English speak English their way, and we Americans speak English our American English way. And in Amsterdam, everybody spoke English because they could speak 5 languages, but they spoke it with a Dutch accent. And so I wasn't hearing my language, and I realized then that I had to get out and go back home to New York, and I just had to do it. I couldn't just continue to think that all of the stuff, the sentences I was writing down, and I wasn't pulling anything together. I didn't go to writing school. I never had a writing course. I taught myself to write from reading, which I think ultimately is the best way. And thinking about, why did Jean Rhys put her adverb here and not there, and just reading very, very closely, and then doing it and struggling with sentences and taking advantage of some of the magazines that had started up and getting something published in it. Money was never an issue for me. I wasn't thinking about that I would make money from writing, and that was probably very foolish, but this was just something that I had to do, and all of that would come later. And I knew I had to really force myself to get myself to write. There were so many reasons, including huge insecurity, lack of confidence, not to do it. But I didn't want to be the person who hadn't done it when I told myself I would. It was sort of like I had made a pledge to myself. I would do this thing, so now I had to do it. And it was only I was telling myself to do that. So there's no simple answer, or even there's no complicated answer to that. If you have a real desire and need, and what are all those other words to write, you'll keep going. The difference between people who keep writing and those who don't, it's really interesting to me, having now taught workshops and seeing those people who go on and those who don't. And you can't really tell who's going to keep doing it and who isn't. But it is, I guess, a question of volition and will, that you will yourself to keep doing it, even though, and again, I'm not saying, I don't want to kind of heroicize or make great, if you want to do it, you have to do it. That's the difference.
Can we talk a little bit about publication, though? Because
okay.
Usually some people, I mean, a lot of young writers, I know I did, I felt like, well, I can't really feel like a writer until I'm published.
I think it does help.
And something that, sorry to interrupt, but like something that I read a lot now, when you read like poets and writers or something like that, is, young writers coming up, like, you need to learn how to be the new writer, and writing's changing, writing is dying, like maybe you're going to have to, like start a blog or serialize your first novel online, or, it's really hard to get published now and avoid the slush pile and self-publish on Kindle. So I think the like specter of like the digital age like crushing publishing is also like scaring a lot of young writers.
But it is a form of publishing, and there are different, I mean, the way of the modernists in the early part of the 20th century was to publish themselves. And actually, in the late 19th century, wasn't there the Yellow Book? And people have always found ways to publish themselves, I suppose, particularly in the modern era. Distribution, it may be difficult. The internet offers a lot. Everything seems, though, to be to use a very old-fashioned metaphor, the horse before the cart. And it seems to me first you write, and you think about your writing, and you think about your writing, and you keep writing, and you keep writing, and then you worry about getting published. It's all been speeded up so much, and I think it makes everybody feel even worse. I mean, isn't it ironic? You're going to live way longer than people did at the beginning of the 20th century. I mean, our lives there's so many people over 100 now. It's extraordinary. and in their 90s. So you're going to live a long life if you know, are fortunate and have some good genes and good habits, I suppose, in certain ways. But so why does it all have to happen when you're 20 or 25 or 30? I mean, there's time. You do have to figure out your day job. You know, what are you going to do to support yourselves? That's a different question, and that's always been a question for writing. I mean, read what's that wonderful book by George Gissing? That novel. What? New Grub Street. Yes. I mean, if you want to be despairing about being a writer, read New Grub Street. But I did read that.
Well, a
years
lot of our
ago.
day jobs are teaching now
Yes.
for writers. I mean, do you
Yes,
have
I mean
thoughts
there is a systemic thing here. We teach MFAs or undergraduate. There's no harm in that. I think all of this argument about how awful MFAs are, the whole thing to me is just asking the wrong questions. Are people learning anything? Good. If they're learning something, that's great. I've taught in MFA programs both for art and writing and also just for writing. And if you become a better reader because you understand writing better and you think about it more, that's cool. What's wrong with that? I don't see the idea of professionalization is something that started, I think, back in 1960s, 1970s, especially specialization, different studies, you know, where people would go into film. You'd be, you know, but in my generation, you wanted to know everything about film, even though you were an English major or a history minor, as I was. So you saw the silent films. You saw the work from the 30s and 40s and 50s. You saw all of Hitchcock, you saw all of Truffaut, you saw all of Antonioni. That was just, you know, it wasn't because you went to film school. It was because that's what you thought you needed to know to be in the world. I think it's a real question to think now, what is it that you need to know to be in the world? I'm not sure what's needed to know, but whatever that is, you have to find it out for yourselves, whatever you're studying. You know, I mean, it really is a question. What do you need to know? And I ask myself that often.
Well, I remember you also said in an interview this question about whether MFA programs are, or creative writing programs in the academy, whether they're detrimental to the writer or not. You said there have always been bad writers.
That's right.
Right?
Yes.
Yeah. Questions? Yeah.
Well, I guess this kind of goes along with how you said, you know, that there's not necessarily a rush to do everything, you know, when you're 20, when you're 25, but on a smaller scale, I'm just wondering about, like, the pace of writing and, like, how to pace yourself when you're writing, because I feel like it's sort of frustrating when, like, you want to tell a story and you want to tell it as well as possible, and for me, like, I mean, like, there's those supposed to be like two types of writers, like the swoopers and the bangers. I don't know if that's like exactly.
What is
never
this?
heard
A
this.
sweep is that an Englishism? A sweeper and a banger? No, bangers and mash.
That was like a quote from Kurt Vonnegut. It's like there's the ones that kind of just like swoop in and really quickly finish a story, or like, you know, and then they kind of iron out all the kinks later. And then there's the people that go line by line, and it's like you don't move on to the next line until the last one is done. And like, I definitely feel like I'm in the latter category. That it's like I prefer to just feel satisfied with something before I move forward. But then it's not like you really have an infinite amount of time. And like, if you're in certain situations where you need to have something by a certain deadline or whatever, then you kind of need to push forward and say, like, okay, I'm not going to get this perfect right away. I'm not going to necessarily have this at the level that I want to have it, but I just need to finish this story. So I guess it's like, how do you pace yourself so that you're able to tell a story and tell a story to fruition, and then still like have these more formal elements that you want to put in?
When I was in college, I never could finish anything. and I would bargain with my teachers because I was so insecure and finishing essays, and papers, and so on. With that background, it made it more important to me that to start earlier with a story. If let's say I agree to write something for an art catalog or and I usually write stories, fiction for artists and catalogs. I'll say, how long do I need for this? It's supposed to be 2,000 words. And I'll give myself at least a month or 6 weeks. I won't start it 2 weeks before, because even if I just write a few sentences 6 weeks before, and then I know that I'm thinking about it, and sometimes that's very, very hard. But I guess I'm a banger, not a sweeper. I've never used it. But I write word by word. And I don't go too far ahead because it seems to me I'm building from the words I'm using and the stories coming out of that. But you have to learn to give yourself more time then. And I'll just try to find as much time as possible. I also can't, the reason it takes me so long to write novels lately is with teaching, I can't keep the novel in my head the way I do because I don't make notes. And so I either write in, say, I've got 8 months now, maybe I can get 100 pages done or something like that. So you sort of begin to know yourself. But you obviously then can't leave anything last minute.
Yeah.
You just can't do that.
I guess like as kind of just a follow-up, it's like what do you do when you don't have a huge stretch of time? It's like, because I feel like it kind of is like this point where I need to get into the zone before it kind of starts coming quickly, you know. But like if you have only a short amount of time and you have a busy schedule, then like how can you?
What is your schedule? No, I don't mean your but I mean, are you in graduate school?
No, undergrad. But I just feel like you don't always have like a stretch of time without other obligations where you can just sit and write, you know.
Well, that's true. I mean, that's life. And but some, I think I read Tilly Olsen's book Silences years ago, and didn't she get up at 4 in the morning? I mean, something I couldn't do, I have to tell you.
That's
but,
crazy.
You know, but she would get up before her family was up, before she had work to do, and she would write then. She found a way to do, people do find ways to do it. The other thing is, there's no length that a story has to be. A story could be a sentence, or a story could be 5,000 sentences. So that's another way to think about writing. You don't it's not prescribed.
Okay, 1 or 2 more questions. Emily?
I guess the kind of question that goes along with that is, what is your process of drafting like? Like, what do you expect to get out of the first draft, second draft? How many drafts do you usually write?
I don't believe in drafts. I just,
That makes sense because you say you write word by
by
word.
word, yeah, I write word by word, and I go over something until I feel I can go on. I usually don't have the whole story in mind. In fact, I never have a whole story in mind. I have ideas about what I want a story to be about, but I'm inventing the story as I go along. So I'm finding it as I go along. I know a lot of writers, very good writers, who really can write a story out, and they do work in drafts. But I can't do that because I'm looking at it, I'm saying, this is crap. What am I writing? You know, that's just not the way I write.
So you find the story as you go, but then you have to go back and rewrite large chunks of it?
I generally don't have to do that.
Wow.
In American Genius, a comedy, because it formally was very different from from the book before it, No Lease on Life. and from the other books too, and they were different from each other. I did go back to elaborate something. Occasionally, I would do that. It was more because it was even more associational than I had originally thought. And the book I'm working on now is it's using both he's both making theoretical arguments in it, and also the story of many other stories are being told as well. So it's two different kinds of writing, and that's gotten me really confused at times. So I just go along and try to do it as best I can. I don't have a...
All right, I have time for one more question. Chris?
I like how you make jokes about your writing and writing in general. So I just was wondering how lighthearted are you when you approach your writing as opposed to, something like Cormac McCarthy who's like really serious?
I'm deadly serious. No, I mean, it's gallows humor I live with, and when I'm not finding the way I want to write something, I'm completely miserable. But why would I want to tell you that, really? And again, it sort of makes the writer into this, and I do think it's also fun. I mean, I also see my pain as funny, too. And that is what makes...
How is it funny?
How is my pain funny?
That's a great title for a story.
My pain is funny? I'm not concerned about your pain, but my pain is funny. Well, it just seems so... Of course, yes, it's painful to write or something like that. I just... No, I'm miserable often. When I can't, I'm given to depression. I always have been, and so on. But that's probably what I would bring to any profession, anything I did. And I don't know that it's in the nature of writing. I don't know that anything is. Well, certainly anything I do is natural, or anything. I mean, the whole question of what is natural, cultural, or so on. I also think I'm really damn lucky to know what I want to do, and that I'm driven to do something, because God knows what I would do otherwise, So I guess because I joke, but jokes are very serious.
Absolutely, yeah.
Read Freud's the jokes and their relationship to the unconscious. It's a brilliant book.
Well, pain is funny. Well, let's end with that.
Pain is funny.
Let's end with that. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.
I just want to remind everyone that